Do you know that the issue of trafficking of persons on the continent, especially children and women, could as well be something that you are a partaker in? How well do you know that child or that so-called relative in your home who's working as a house help? This is some of the dynamics involved in human trafficking. And that's our focus today on VSA. Welcome, I'm Sulaiman. Human trafficking is one of Africa's biggest challenges, an enemy of human dignity, a form of modern-day slavery. It has ruined lives, homes, and the future of millions of people. Well, it reeks of exploitation and abuse, domestic servitude, and all forms of ills that negate humanity. Now, a global industry worth $150 billion, human trafficking is a scourge on the continent. An average woman in Africa who is trafficked for sex makes a profit of $100,000 annually, and 100% to 1,000% return on investment. A significant amount of this money goes to, someone somewhere, leaders of trafficking networks. In Africa, there are more than 10 million victims of modern slavery, more than 20% of the world's total. Human trafficking is a business worth $13.1 billion on the continent, and two-thirds of it, that's around $8.1 billion, coming from sex trafficking alone. Other than sex trafficking, there are also victims of forced labor, children who are forced to become slaves in factories, homes, forced into marriages, forced to work in mines. Forced labor has 3 times more victims than sex trafficking, but sexual exploitation generates more. So women and children make up 72% of trafficking victims in Africa, and yearly child victims increase. Now, human trafficking is a broad spectrum daredevil phenomenon in Africa, and it needs the attention of the continent. Joining me on Village Square, Africa, to discuss this, Collins Waker, a global affair analyst. He joins me from Belgium. And Ruth Yvonne Benson Idausa, the founder and executive director of Pathfinders Justice Initiative and a leading expert on the subject of modern slavery in sub-Saharan Africa. She'll be speaking from New York City. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to VSA.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Let me start with Yvonne Benson Idausa. You see, the big question we should be asking first is, how did this all start?
Well, I think if I knew that, I'd probably be, certainly be the answer to a lot of problems around the world. But I think it's it's a combination, unfortunately, of just the historical nature of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade on the continent. I think it goes all the way back to the manner in which human beings were subjugated and really degraded to a level of becoming commodities. Back in the 15th century, and I think from that point on, it just became part of the culture, and it's morphed, into various forms over the years. But the reality is that there are actually more people that are enslaved in this day and age than in any other time in history. And so I think that's probably the starting point. It all started with colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, unfortunately.
And trying to unravel all of this, one of the things I realize is that a lot of people are actually giving, wings to this modern day slavery without even knowing a thing or two about it. Tell us, especially for those in parts of Africa, Nigeria inclusive, who have what they call maids, house helps. Are these also sometimes part of those, giving wind to what exactly we're discussing at the moment?
I mean, absolutely. I think
Avon has tried to give a perfect historical perspective, but next to that, indeed, is the point that you have raised. There appear to be some form of traffickers in every one of us, especially those of us based in Africa, either as a consequence of what we do, choices that we make in terms of hiring housemaids, gate men, and so on and so forth, at conditions that are completely inhuman, or being unwilling accomplices, in those practices based on ignorance, seeing things, looking away, and not, actually confronting those, those practices. And again, some of those victims don't quite know that they are victims of, slavery, human trafficking, and all of that, because some of them, as a consequence of perhaps poverty and all of that, actually do believe that those who have given them accommodation, to be used as slaves, are actually doing them a favor. Otherwise, their conditions would have been worse. So yes, that is the human aspect to it, next to the historical perspective that Avon very accurately painted.
Let me bring in Ruth here. Ruth, first, apologies. I'm quite sure you didn't hear that that was actually for Collins. Anyway, listen to Collins. He said something about two categories of persons who may not know that they are actually, indulging or in this kind of crime. Those who harbor some of these people, these workers, and even some of the victims not also knowing that they are being used as slaves. Tell us how it works, because we understand that sometimes, especially even in Africa, we'll come back to Europe and America, even within the continent, people have, workers, domestic hands who work for them, but at the end of the day, monies don't go to these people who work for them. Some other person, there's a third party, or even a fourth person, who takes the money at the end of the day.
Right. And I think, one of the distinctions when it comes to trafficking, because, there's a significant portion of people who have house help, or people that are, working supposedly within their homes. I think one of the distinctions is the element of exploitation. And that's what sort of differentiates it from somebody else that could actually be receiving a salary. What you tend to see in our context sometimes is, what we refer to as debt bondage, which is where somebody has to pay an extraordinary amount of money as a way of repaying a certain amount, or paying somebody specifically for something else. And so you see that in the context of what we refer to as house help, where children may be brought from the village to the city, and they're ultimately involved in trafficking in a way that was not originally intended. And so we tend to see that in that context. We also tend to see it in the context of what we refer to as money wife in Nigeria, which is where you'll have somebody that is essentially given, right, as a way of compensating someone in a situation where the father, for example, could not repay a debt back to somebody. And so I think ultimately the idea of just trading in human beings is really the underlying issue, particularly in the context as we have experienced it on the African continent.
Philip, let me continue on that angle you raised. And one of the things we found out is that the communal life of Africans, especially in the western part of Africa, where people are being asked to live with some relatives with the hope that that relative will help in educating that child or helping that child learn a trade. Ultimately, we understand that sometimes it turns out to be something we're discussing now, some form of slavery. How do you help a child or someone who's gone through such route? Well, it looks like Philip can't hear me, and let me come to Ruth. Ruth, I hope you heard the question for Philip, because what plays out in some parts of the continent is people willingly giving out their children to some relatives or some richer persons in the community to see that they help fund education for this child. But it turns out, you know, that never does happen.
Right, and I think that, you know, that's part of the underlying issue, which is poverty. Right, Nigeria, for example, is now the poverty capital of the world, meaning that there are over 80 million people that are living in abject poverty, people who are living on less than $1.90 a day, and so that tends to put people, particularly when there's an economic downturn like we're currently having in the recession as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, really tends to put people in a place of desperation. And so even prior to the onset of the pandemic, you saw situations where people were actually essentially handing their children over to people who were living in the cities or elsewhere in the hopes that could actually advance their life in some way. And ultimately, like I said, not every situation ultimately becomes a situation of trafficking, but because we have this communal nature of trust and, you know, just being willing to, you know, to hand our children over, what we tend to see is that can become abusive, right? And ultimately a form of exploitation.
You know, Africa, as it is, has a network of traffickers, some of whom we hear are prosecuted and also released. Now, Collins, good to know that you're back. Sorry, we lost you for a bit. Thanks to Ruth for helping, you know, explain that question. Africa has a network of traffickers, Philip, some of whom we hear are being prosecuted and some are released afterwards. Perhaps we should start asking how we can do, or what really we can do to curb the excesses of such people, knowing full well that some of them live within the continent.
Yeah, I believe that combating trafficking in persons is not something, you know, that has to be done in a reactive manner. There has to be a proactive approach to it. And I believe that the international bodies, especially the U.S. Department of State, has actually provided, you know, a global framework that countries can begin to develop, and South Africa is on record to have developed a national policy framework for this, which aims to prohibit, prevent, and then punish. Okay, those are the three pillars of you know, the framework, and I believe that if countries begin to systematically apply such proactive policy measures, then you do not leave it to the instinct or the discretion of one country or the other. Because like we know, Congo, a Democratic Republic of Congo, has been the bad boy in the class for quite a long time. However, we have observed that in the past several years, the figure, still very, very bad, has, you know, been reduced, not because there was a national policy, but because there was a one-off decision to combat strictly, you know, child soldiers, and that, but there are still other forms like domestic slavery and so on and so forth. So yes, the approach has to be a proactive one rather than reactive.
Ruth, you know, in Nigeria, there is a body called NAPTIP, and of course, we've also seen the big work that the International Organization on Migration, IOM, is doing in trying to reduce the level of trafficking. Perhaps your body, your NGO is also working to giving, you know, assistance in that direction. What can the media and the people do to further strengthen the fight against the scourge?
Well, I think part of what we have to do is, really pay a bit more attention, right? Trafficking is generally referred to as being hidden in plain sight, right? So in Nigeria, we're almost accustomed to seeing forms of trafficking that we may not necessarily even label as trafficking. You see children on the street begging, what we refer to as forced begging. You see children who are being forced into marriages who are under the age of 18. These are forms of trafficking. Domestic servitude, like we talked about earlier, is also a different form of trafficking. And so I think what's important is that we actually have to open our eyes to start becoming a bit more conscious about the reality that's really in our face on a day-to-day basis. In addition, I think the media's responsibility is to really prioritize this issue and start to craft stories that will make sure that these stories are actually part of our consciousness, right? So the fact that you can see a child begging on the street every single day, they're selling a tray of plantain chips, and we just drive by as if that's normal. In many ways, we as a collective have normalized many different forms of trafficking, and so I think part of the media's role is to have conversations like this, right? To really ensure that these issues are within the consciousness of the average day-to-day person, so that when you come across it, you identify it for what it is, and then can take the necessary action by reporting it to agencies such as NAPTIP or to organizations like mine, which are at the forefront of really tackling this issue head on.
Colin, help us here, because without a source, you can actually get this business going. You have been following this globally. Tell us, if you will, the sources. Where do they get these women and children from?
Well, broadly speaking, the source of the victims is actually the most vulnerable countries of the world. And unfortunately, Africa, is at the heart of this vulnerability that we are talking about. Ruth has, given a paintbrush of, some of the vices that lead to it, beggars on the streets, traditional practices, poverty, and so on and so forth. So it starts from there. Some end up, inter-Africa. Others go more global, like international, trafficking, where people undertake all sorts of, dangerous trips through the Sahara Desert, and then crossing over via Libya. That happens to be an ungovernable country. So law and order broken down. People who survive, the situation in Libya, then cross over to to Europe to be used as a sex slave. So yes, it's a vicious circle, and any attempt to combat it has got to include measures in the source countries, Africa to be more specific, and then also measures in the destination countries, Europe. And if I have a bit of latitude later in the program, I would like to highlight some of what has been done out here in Belgium, to help to reintegrate victims, get those victims to cooperate with government and NGOs in tracking down the traffickers, and then prosecute them and reintegrate the victims so that they become, full-fledged members of the society. That would be an example of how to deal with us, so that you stop treating the victims as people who have done something wrong. No, they are victims and they need to be seen that way.
Ruth and Collins, when we come back after the break, we'll be talking specifically about what both of you are doing. Ruth, for your organization based in New York, what you're doing in Nigeria and other parts of the world, as well as, Collins, you'll be telling us pretty much more what the Belgian government is doing in helping, stem the tide of human trafficking, especially from Africa. That's when we return. Well, the trafficking of persons is our conversation today. And of course, there is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was designed to help reduce human trafficking in the world. many African countries don't comply with it, as human trafficking is still a very big problem. Africa's most populous country and its biggest economy, Nigeria, is rated 32nd of 167 countries rated for its volume of human trafficking. There are about 1.386 million victims of human trafficking in Nigeria alone. Nigeria, like South Africa, Ghana, Cameroon, Senegal, Ivory Coast, is a source, transit and destination of human trafficking victims in Africa. Nigeria especially is known to engage in both internal and external trafficking, as highlighted by my two guests, which means sexual exploitation and forced labor go on within Nigeria, and victims are also exported abroad. In Kenya and Uganda, there are more than 300,000 victims of human trafficking. Across the continent, young girls are being forced into prostitution, and young boys are forced to work in mines owned by foreign companies. There are about 7.6 million victims of human trafficking in every 1,000 people in Africa. This is higher than the global average of 5.4 in every 1,000. Like women and girls, children make up 24% of trafficking victims in Africa. Sex trafficking is an issue that has bedeviled Africa and Nigeria especially for decades. Now, tales of violence, battery and bruising told by victims in Libya, which holds most of Africa's victims trying to make their way to Europe. Africans, West Africans especially, are also found in Italy working as sex slaves for their masters, and these people dare the odds, they dare the government, and they dare humanity, and that is why this is making a case here in Village Square, Africa. Well, we still have our two guests, Ruth Yvonne Benson-Idauze. She's joining me from New York City in the United States, and of course from Belgium, Collins Nweke. Thank you both for being with us here on VSA. Let me start with you, Ruth. Now, time for us to start talking about what we can do, the we here, Africans, be inclusive. What can we do to stop this very ugly and worrisome menace? You have an NGO, and tell us the work you're doing so far and how much of help you need.
Well, you know, I think as an African woman, I'm a strong proponent for African solutions to African problems, and so I appreciate, I think, the efforts that are made by international bodies to address this issue, particularly because of the migration that ultimately ends up on their shores. But for me, I think it's mostly important that the people who are actually closest to the issue find a way of creating and curating solutions that are actually tackling these issues head on. And so, it's important not just for smaller NGOs like mine, but that the government actually take a stance against human trafficking by prioritizing these issues. And so I think the efforts that we're making are certainly assisting and supporting government agencies like NAPTIP and the Edo State Task Force Against Human Trafficking. But at the end of the day, it's really up to the government, which has the ability to scale some of these efforts that we're making to start to prioritize the value, I think, of human beings in general, right? So what we see is that even though organizations are trying to work on this issue, we still see levels of government complicity, right, when it comes to the issue of human trafficking. The reality as well is that the underlying issues, the root causes that are allowing for the proliferation of trafficking, such as patriarchy that's written into our laws, it's in our customs, it's in our religions. These are the things that need to be tackled by the government as a whole. There's very little effort that my organization or smaller NGOs that are working on this issue can have when it comes to these larger scale issues. But that doesn't mean that we stop or that we're not taking the necessary efforts to do so. And so, for an organization like mine, we're focused both on the prevention of trafficking. We have an arm called the Justice Initiative, which generally we refer to as influencing the influencers, right? How can we possibly convince, government agencies or people who have the power to end trafficking to actually prioritize this issue. And so we conduct research, we engage them through trainings, through workshops, and things like that. But we're also ensuring that the community takes ownership of this issue, right, and starts to view trafficking as a crime, not just against an individual, but against the community as a whole. And so that's where we actually bring the community together to help us craft interventions that are going to tackle human trafficking. And then the third arm of what we do is ultimately just working with women who are potentially vulnerable to becoming trafficked. We know that, generally women who are in these situations are in the situations as a result of an abuse of their vulnerabilities, right? And so what we're doing is figuring out who is potentially vulnerable to becoming trafficked and really closing that gap. We're also working with survivors of trafficking, women who have already been trafficked, whether they were trafficked locally or they were repatriated back from Europe, and really providing access, which is the issue that a lot of people are lacking. It's just that they have the ability, they have the talent, but they just do not have the access to be able to get solutions to the basic needs, healthcare, education, and things of that nature.
Well, I'll come back to you so that we can talk pretty much more about, Africa and specifically Nigeria, some of those places you've just mentioned. Collins, help us here. Give us the global perspective now, especially on what countries like Belgium, where you reside, is doing to help in stem the tide of trafficking of persons and women to Europe and other places.
Yeah, I mean, Ruth has again given a paintbrush of the practicality of the matter at hand in terms of what they do as an organization to actually provide succor to the government, to individuals. Now, on my own part, I believe that at the policy level, I mean, being a municipal legislator since 2006, I've been working more on the policy side, and I took even more interest in this matter in the late 2000s, actually, when the issue was actually brought very heavily on the political agenda, where government took more interest, and then with frameworks such as Trafficking Victims Protection Act of the State Department of the US, you see that more impetus is now being given to those who want to take legislative actions. Now, at the EU levels, there have been all sorts of stakeholder forums organized to sensitize the government, but also to provide them the tools to be able to take to draw the necessary legislations to enable the prevention, protection of citizens, but also, prosecution of perpetrators. So at that level, I believe it's very, very important. But then, in order to ensure that theory and practice meet one another or each other, I think it is important, of course, that the bridge is built between government on the one hand, and then organizations like Pathfinder, of Ruth, so that they are able to cross-fertilize and begin to tackle the issue more head-on.
I'll come back. Let's start talking about the people. And Ruth, in all of this, we understand that in places where there is armed conflict, poverty, we have seen a surge in people being trafficked. What about those cases? Are there situations where people have voluntarily, willingly given themselves up to be so trafficked out of Africa?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I should just make sure that we're clear that consent does not necessarily mean that trafficking has not occurred, right? But the reality is that what you tend to see is that desperation or desperate times call for desperate measures, right? So we saw during, and I'll use the COVID-19 pandemic as an example. Once what that ultimately did, particularly in Africa and Nigeria more specifically, is that it really highlighted the differences, right? The stark differences between the people who have and people who have not, right? What you saw was that a lot of people did not have the cushion, right, to be able to brace themselves to get through the initial lockdown. And so you saw a lot of people becoming increasingly desperate, right? You saw an increase in crime. You saw an increase even in migration. Even though the borders were technically closed, there was still a flow of people trying to leave Nigeria to try to reach Europe, where they believe that ultimately things will be better for them. And so I think that the reality is that there's only so much that smaller organizations, again, like mine, can have. But what we ultimately all need to do is really take ownership of this issue, right? By putting into place the things that we would like for ourselves, right? The situations where, yeah, I think when you look at the average person in Nigeria, they don't have access to education. They don't have access to basic healthcare, right? So if you see a mother who has a child who is, suffering with malaria, and they don't even have the money to buy malaria drugs, it begs the question of what the expectations are for that mother. There's no way that I will see any of my children starve if someone is offering me an opportunity to better my life elsewhere. And so I think we have to take a less judgmental approach toward people who are, quote unquote, volunteering to be trafficked, and really look at the underlying issues that are allowing for the proliferation of trafficking, particularly on the African continent.
Colin's listening to Ruth. She made it clear that for the fact that some have willingly submitted themselves to be sought trafficked doesn't mean that trafficking hasn't occurred. Now, it comes to education. Now, for the continent, do you think that we've been able to educate the people enough for them to know the dangers inherent in the trafficking business, so that they can start speaking up against what is happening to young women and especially children on the continent?
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about this education, it's got to start from a very, very young age. As a matter of fact, even starting such education from the kindergarten, from the nursery school, isn't a bad idea. Because we're dealing with an issue that can only be combated with a change of mindset, change of attitude, and change of, traditional concepts of communalism and so on and so forth, which actually belies some of these very, very unholy practices. Now, you begin to dismantle them from very, very young age. And that was why I referred to, fighting them from the from very, very early age. And again, if I may refer to Belgium, because talking about people voluntarily, getting into the practice, of course, at the heart of it is poverty. The understandable urge to want to better your life. But indeed, that doesn't mean that the person who voluntarily gave himself or herself up for such practice has got to be, looked at as a bad person. Now, what Belgium did to be able to combat that was to create very good incentives for victims who, because they go into there, some are promised residence permit, jobs, and so on and so forth. So government created this opportunity for victims to come out, report themselves to a particular place where they are accommodated, actually given the right to stay in the country, given a job, on the condition, of course, that they cooperate with government to get the perpetrators to book. And we have seen it work massively. From 1,000 cases a year, about a decade ago, we are now looking at less than 400 a year. So that means that such is working, and the attention, the focus has got to be taken away from the victims and place it squarely on the hands of, the perpetrators, so that the victims see a safe place, and from that safe place, they can cooperate with government and begin to dismantle the network.
You know, Ruth, on the surface, this whole business looks so easy, but it is a dangerous path, isn't it?
I mean, I think it's certainly dangerous for, depending on what side.
So we're talking about a cartel here. You're fighting against a cartel, looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an organized criminal network, right? And so there are aspects of it that I think could be potentially dangerous. But for me, I think on a personal level, this is what my life's work is. It's what I believe I've been called to do. And so I think to a certain extent, there's no point in focusing on that. Every minute that I spend thinking about my own personal protection and safety, there are tens of thousands of people that are desperately, and daring, the cemetery that the Sahara Desert has become, or the graveyard that the Mediterranean is. And so it's important, I think, that we refocus. And again, my encouragement is not just to people that like me who are doing this work, but to everybody, right? To really start to keep our eyes open and to look out for our neighbors, to look out for the people that are really within our community, because that's ultimately where change starts to happen, right? It's on a micro level, and where you actually are able to see that one child every day, and provide support to the parents who may not be able to put that child in school. I mean, when we know that education and the lack of education, particularly on a primary level, where you find children who are out of school and are not being able to continue their education, that is something that creates a vulnerability to trafficking, and where traffickers can actually take advantage of. So I think it's a matter of all of us, right, collectively putting our own individual concerns aside and looking with an eye of compassion, I think, towards what we can do, not just for ourselves, but for each other.
Philip, talking about the dangers here, one also must understand that as the continent tries to see that there's a stop to all of this, the bad guys are working so hard to ensuring that the business continues for them. Talking about those people who have been rescued, how do we get them truly, reintegrated into our society and not to be stigmatized, because some of them also suffer from such?
Absolutely. I think it's important, again, to re-emphasize the essence of a program such as this, where you initiate a conversation. It's got also to be broken down to the, actually the actual village square conversation, where people gather, in small groups, wherever, and begin to talk about these things so that they know that these people need to be treated with grace. They got in there in the first place, not because they wanted to, but because circumstances forced them in there. Now, that is not to take away from the fact that there are those who willingly, who truly, with their eyes open, walk into such situations. But of course, they need to be made to understand that there are other choices out there for them. At the end of it, government has a very, very important role to play in terms of creating perspectives, creating opportunities for young people, because that will then take the incentives away. And again, let's not forget that the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime was actually the international institution that first flagged this issue up, because it was understood that there is a very strong criminal network behind trafficking in human beings. And so that tells us that you are fighting against a very powerful cartel, just like the drug cartels you have in different parts of the world. They are not just sitting there and waiting. You get some figures of about $150 billion US. That is the turnover in this business. And those who are in it are actually well connected. They have all the finances available to them. And so they too are fighting back. But it is only through global, platform, global networking, that it can be combated, decisively.
Ruth, top of on my mind is the issue of a willing buyer, willing seller. There must be someone, who's willing. Sadly, I really hate to use the word. We're talking about humans like you and I. Someone willing to buy a human, and someone willing to pay money. So this takes us to how we can actually stretch it away from the continent to Europe and even America, where you are at the moment. How can we make this awareness, go far and wide, to the extent that those who are in the business of buying humans, these people from Africa, totally look into doing something else?
Well, like you said, it's basic economics, right? It's supply and demand. The average cost of a lifetime slave, think about this, is $90. So you can buy a human being for $90, and, they can make you, on average, particularly when it comes to sexual exploitation, $100,000 annually, right? So the return on investment is absolutely ridiculous. But I think part of the issue is that you have, individuals, men, unfortunately, who have, degraded women to the point where they can actually purchase them, right? There's not a part of their consciousness that sees them as their mother, as their sister, as their daughter, right? There's a way of compartmentalizing that has been normalized in many ways. And I think part of the issue is that international government, destination countries, particularly where the bodies of African women are being purchased and recycled over and over again, really have to start to prioritize this issue and not just focus on the migration aspect of it, but the dehumanization that's actually happening to the bodies of women and girls in particular, right? You have to start to criminalize the purchase of another human being. You and I can sit here and we can think about it, and the concept of buying a person seems foreign, right, in some ways. But by allowing for purchasers, right, men, like I said, unfortunately, and that doesn't take away some of the responsibility from women who are the primary traffickers, particularly of Nigerian girls in Europe. But by the failure to criminalize the purchase of another human being, ultimately what you're saying is that you're condoning it. In many ways, and because particularly these women don't look like your mothers or your daughters or your sisters, right? And so I think that's part of the issue, is that there has to be more law enforcement. There have to be more convictions globally. In 2019, there were only 11,000 convictions in the entire world. When we know that there are over 40 million victims. In Africa, there were only about 900 convictions globally. And so we have to start to prioritize this issue and take it more seriously, particularly when it comes to the bodies of our children, which on the African continent make up about 60% of the people who are being trafficked.
Well, Collins, you said earlier that there's been a significant reduction in cases of people being trafficked to places, especially Belgium. Tell us, if you will, if this is as a result of our prosecution and bringing maybe perpetrators to book.
Prosecution, yes. And so that begins then to narrow the size of the network, but also the empowerment of the victims, to let them know that they are not alone in this. We are in it together. You have no reason to be afraid. Speak out even when you are not sure of what is happening to you, even when you were a willing, person that actually gave yourself up. There is, succor for you. Speak out, and we will give you the protection that you need. So that sort of campaign took time to take root, and once it took root, people now started coming out, and once you come out, your residence is legalized, you are given a place to stay, you are given a job, and then your life returns to normal, and then you understand that you do not owe that perpetrator, your master or your madam, you do not owe that person anything because you have all that you need, which is government, So yes, that has. But of course, another aspect of it, which is on the legislative side, is that the concept of national interest is gradually being redefined. Now, Europeans or the Western countries in general are no longer seeing issues happening in Africa, bad things happening in Africa as problems far from their bed. Because one way or the other, it has a way of actually coming back close to them to begin to disrupt some of the practices, some of the policies that they had put in place without taking those things into consideration. Take illegal migration, for example. So for that reason, they are taking the issues more seriously by trying to combat them right from the source before it gets to them.
Ruth, let's start winding down. Do you think what we're doing is enough to see the scourge coming to an end anytime soon?
Certainly not. I think that there are not enough people engaged on the subject. I think that there is somehow we've been able to other people, right? Put certain people into certain categories, or close our eyes or turn a blind eye to certain aspects of things. And so I think, for us, trafficking requires the involvement of not just the individual, like I talked about earlier, but also the community as a whole that has to own the issue, right? That has to say that this is not just a crime against an individual within the community, but a crime against the community as a whole. Right? We all have to take this zero tolerance policy or posture, I should say, to the issue of trafficking. But it's not just those two aspects. You also need the government, and I'm not just referring to to the Nigerian government or to the African governments. It's both national and international. All of us, right, have to be able to repudiate the atrocity of purchasing another human being. And I think until we get to that point, until all of us collectively say that we take the stance against it, unfortunate reality is that we're going to see at least some certain levels of it continue to proliferate.
If I go back to Collins, I want to stay with you, Ruth. Because of your background, you should be able to give us an understanding into this. There are many victims who are afraid to tell their stories over fears of being afflicted by voodoo. What's the best way to approach such people?
Yeah, I mean, we see that particularly in Edo State, and you have where they're actually taken to swear that they will remain loyal to their madame, that they will not run away, or that they won't report to police and things like that. And that's the psychological aspect of it that we see that is taking hold, right, on human beings, to the point where people are afraid to even leave their residence, right, once they arrive in Europe, because they've been brainwashed and manipulated, right, to where they're now afraid. And so that's why I mentioned earlier, one of the ways that you address that is by creating African solutions, right, to African problems. Over the years, the European Union has poured millions into this issue, particularly when it relates to migration on the African continent. But in March of 2018, the Oba of Benin, made a proclamation that, basically put a curse on traffickers and released women who had sworn this oath from the bondage that they had to their madams or their traffickers. And as a result of that, I mean, the implications were far-reaching and so much more effective, I should say, than some of the solutions that had been designed in boardrooms in London or elsewhere, right? And so that's why it's so important that we come to the people who actually have the answers and say, look, work alongside of us, work on the community level, like Collins was saying, look at traditional leaders, look at people who have a voice, particularly pastors, in our context in Nigeria, and engage these people to actually come to the table and have a discussion and get them all on board, because that's where you get ownership of the problem, and that's where you actually start to create solutions to it.
So Colin, your final take on this. What else are we likely to be discussing to helping stem the tide of this? Because Ruth has helped us, dismantle the fear in some of these people who have been taken to shrines with the belief that if you squeal out on them, you die. So how else can we, speak to these people to encourage them to speak up, especially now that we are in the age of the new media?
I agree that it's probably going to get worse in some parts of the world before it begins to get better. But there are reasons to be optimistic. One of the reasons for the optimism is the fact that governments across the world, especially in the western part of the world, are beginning to realize the importance of, multi-stakeholders approach to this. They are reaching across the aisles and building partnerships. In the past, this had, concentrated mainly on government and law enforcement agencies. Now we have seen closer collaboration between governments and, private NGOs, private organizations. For example, the implementation partner here in Belgium for government policy on, trafficking against women is a private NGO that actually takes the bulls by the horns, understands government policies, and begin to implement them. So I think closer collaboration between government and organizations, community leaders, faith-based organizations, and so on and so forth, it's so very, very vital in the fight ahead.
I think the last thing there, the faith-based organization truly can help in all of this, because this is a huge discourse on one of the continent's biggest nemesis, and it is just the beginning of many things to be said. Well, thank you very much, Ruth Benson in Idahose, and of course Collins Weke. For our viewer, join us tomorrow as we open more on human trafficking in Africa and find possible solutions to the scourge. And many thanks for being such nice company on the show. You can watch us live on youtube.com/News Central TV and on Star Times at channel 274. You can also check the latest updates on Africa on newscentral.africa. I'm Sulaiman. I'll see you tomorrow.